Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel, where today you're going to hear all about cholera, specifically the cholera epidemics that hit London throughout the 1800s and how a man called John Snow, no, not that John Snow, fixed it all, kinda. This is vaguely the second video in a two-part series, the first of which was my video on the Great Stink of London from last week. You don't have to watch that video to understand what's going on in this one, but it just gives you a little bit more context as to how London ended up in the situation it did. Perhaps you can go and watch it after this one, now you're here. Hint hint. As always with my medical history based videos, I'm going to start by talking about what cholera actually is, a bit of context to this whole thing. And as with the last video in the series, if you're eating, maybe come back to this in a bit. We're going to be talking a lot about poop. And of course, a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this week's video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creative and curious people. We all know by this point that I very much advocate for education and always learning new things, and with Skillshare you can explore new skills, develop existing interests and get lost in your creativity. Whenever I talk to you guys about Skillshare, you know I love to recommend a class I've been using, and I've actually been really enjoying a series right now called Interior Design Basics, Simple Steps to Your Perfect Space by Lauren Cox. As some of you may know, I've recently moved house, I've moved in with my girlfriend, and I've been really enjoying designing our new space. I'm so happy with how the lounge and office have turned out, but I was talking to my girlfriend just last week about how unhappy I am with the bedroom right now. It's very white and cold and boring. I'm just feeling very uninspired by it all. So I thought I'd see if there were any lessons on Skillshare, and of course, this is what I came across. In this 10-part class, Lauren Cox shows you how to transform your home no matter what your style is or your budget, how to figure out your personal design style, how to curate a colour palette, and choose pieces that you'll love and will last. I'm now feeling very inspired and have all this time in the world in lockdown to sort out our very boring bedroom. If you're uncertain what's next for you in these very strange times, creative challenges and productivity classes can be a great way to help you structure your time and set up some achievable goals. Whether you're just wanting to fend off boredom or do some self-care or just become part of a creative community, Skillshare is the best place for you. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description to sign up to Skillshare get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, and after that it's only around $10 or £7 a month. But cholera. So cholera is caused by bacteria called Vibrio cholerae, which is usually found in water. A person can catch cholera by drinking contaminated water or eating food contaminated with said bacteria, which also includes consuming food that's contaminated by feces from a person infected with it. Most people exposed to bacteria don't actually become ill and they don't know they've been infected, but they can still shed the bacteria in their feces for 7 to 10 days and can therefore go on to unknowingly infect others through contaminated water. However, it is not likely to spread directly from one person to another, so just casual contact with an infected person isn't going to get you ill. But if you get their contaminated feces on you, you would get ill. Hygiene is key for preventing cholera. Whilst throughout a lot of history, cholera didn't really care where it struck. I mean, if you were near an unclean water source, you were probably near cholera. Nowadays, modern sewage and water treatment has virtually eliminated cholera in industrialised countries. So much so that on the NHS page about cholera, the main section is simply about how to avoid it whilst travelling. Because it does still exist in many countries around the world, all across Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and Haiti is a particular hotspot in modern day. It's most likely to occur and spread in places with inadequate water treatment, poor sanitation, and inadequate hygiene, and therefore the risk of cholera is highest when poverty, war, or natural disasters force many people to live in crowded conditions. Contaminated water supplies, like I said, are the main cause of cholera, but it's not as straightforward as just drinking unclean water. It can also be caught by eating raw or undercooked seafood, particularly shellfish, that comes from infected waters, or raw unpeeled fruits and vegetables from areas where cholera is rife, caused by uncomposted manure fertilisers or irrigation water containing raw sewage can contaminate the produce. Or even grains such as rice. Rice is literally grown in paddy fields in water and is then cooked in water. If any of this water anywhere in the process is contaminated, you're going to get cholera. Whilst cholera infection is often mild or without symptoms at all for 9 out of 10 people, the main symptom in symptomatic people is, unsurprisingly, diarrhoea, which can appear anywhere from a few hours after ingesting the bacteria to a few days. This diarrhoea comes on very suddenly, and for that 1 out of 10 person, can cause dangerous amounts of fluid loss, as much as a litre every hour. If you ignored my previous warning and are still eating, then I recommend you heed this warning. Put your food down for a second. Cholera can cause diarrhoea that's sometimes described as rice water stools due to the pale, milky appearance that resembles water in which rice has been rinsed. We're really not talking your bog standard diarrhoea here. In the early stages of cholera, you can also see vomiting as well as thirst, obviously, leg cramps and restlessness or irritability. You are rapidly losing your bodily fluids, and in the most severe of cases, cholera can lead to death within mere hours. The specific symptoms for cholera dehydration include irritability, fatigue, sunken eyes, a dry mouth, extreme thirst, no urinating, low blood pressure, an irregular heartbeat, and dry and shriveled skin that's slow to bounce back when it's pinched. Severe cholera can lead quickly to kidney failure, which then leads to shock, coma, and then death. So if you are the 1 out of 10 who happens to come down with the most serious of cholera symptoms, it's of utmost importance that you keep as hydrated as possible. Although that's just good advice for anyone with any level of diarrhoea. An oral rehydration solution is recommended as soon as possible, which would come under different names and brands depending on where you are in the world. The good news is if a cholera patient is successfully treated quickly with adequate hydration, they're very likely to survive. Fewer than 1% of cholera patients actually die from the illness. You can be treated with antibiotics, which can shorten the course of the illness, but honestly, you're better just stay as hydrated as possible. And there is also a vaccine available for cholera, but it's not something that's commonly administered here in the UK, nor over in the USA it seems. This is because we're just not at risk of catching cholera in our day-to-day lives. According to the NHS website, the vaccine is only recommended if you're travelling to an area where cholera is common, or you'll be visiting remote places without access to medical care, or if you're an aid or disaster relief worker going to an area where a cholera outbreak is likely. The vaccine here in the UK is given as a drink. It's 2 doses, 6 weeks apart, that provide protection for up to 2 years. But of course, whilst we are lucky in industrialised countries not to have to worry about cholera in our day-to-day lives, that's sadly not the case for everywhere around the world. As I mentioned previously, many places around the world do not have access to the facilities that so many of us take for granted. The most simple thing, access to clean and safe water. Many people have no choice but to use and consume contaminated water daily. Today, in 2021, it's still endemic in many countries. Whilst I struggled to find the most up-to-date 2020 information on cholera epidemics, there were reports of outbreaks in Sudan and Yemen in 2019. The outbreak in Yemen was actually declared the worst in recorded history, having struck first in 2016, surged in May 2017 and continued to flare up from there. As of an NPR article dated April 2019, there have been at least 1,350 cholera deaths in Yemen. The last report I could find on the World Health Organization website was from 2017, which reported a total of 1,227,391 cases of cholera worldwide, which included 5,654 deaths from 34 different countries. I think a lot of people think of cholera in terms of being a historical disease, but that's just not the case. It's just as prevalent now as it was back in the 1800s. But this is a history video, and therefore we should probably talk a bit about history. The World Health Organization website describes cholera as a genie that got out of the bottle, and is proving very difficult to put back in. The first recorded instance of cholera is reported to be in 1563 in an Indian medical report, but it's thought that the disease may have existed in India as early as 400 or 500 BC. I actually found it very hard to trace cholera throughout history for a brief synopsis in this video, but I was listening to my favourite podcast of all time, This Podcast Will Kill You, in which they state that the first person to use the word cholera to describe this intestinal illness was Hippocrates. And seeing as I trust the errands from This Podcast Will Kill You with my life, I'm going to completely trust them on that one. But from there, from Hippocrates' mention, we have little more evidence of such a disease. We see evidence of lots of diseases on ancient skeletons now, but cholera leaves no evidence, so we can't really trace it. In 1543, a Portuguese man called Gaspar Correa visited India and wrote in his book Legendary India of an illness rife there that he called maroxy, a disease that caused vomiting and cramps and could kill a man within hours. It's thought that maroxy is likely cholera. For hundreds of years, it seems that this bacteria was solely confined to India. As far as my research told me, it never really reached anywhere else. But in terms of the modern narrative of the disease, our story begins in 1817, when it spread from its original source in the Ganges Delta in India across the world, becoming one of the scariest illnesses of the 19th century. And that's saying something because people had a lot of illnesses to be scared of in the 19th century. The original spread of cholera in 1817 was propelled by the Industrial Revolution, its rapid modernisation and movement of people. The Europeans established trade routes throughout India, and soon the disease, which may have stemmed from an outbreak in Jessore, India from contaminated rice, was rife throughout the majority of India, as well as modern-day Myanmar and modern-day Sri Lanka. By 1820, cholera had spread throughout most of Asia. Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, China, Japan, and more, where it ravaged these populations. This was considered to be the first cholera pandemic, but it didn't quite reach Western Europe at this point. British troops did manage to bring it to the Persian Gulf, where it slowly made its way into the easternmost countries of Europe, so we're talking Turkey, Syria, and southern Russia. But this pandemic naturally died out 6 years after it began, thanks in part to a particularly bad winter in 23-24, which probably killed the bacteria. But there weren't many years of peace, for the bacteria was just laying in wait in India, where it seemed to thrive in the Ganges. Whilst the date of origin of the second pandemic is disputed, it's thought to have started by the end of the 1820s. This particular outbreak is thought to have originated in the northeastern province of Bengal in India, from where it travelled outwards once again. It hit Russia, where the troops were ordered to Poland, bringing the disease with them. From there, Hungary's hit, along with Finland, Sweden, and eventually in 1831, England, Wales, and Scotland. The first identified and reported case of cholera in Britain was in October 1831, where a Kilson from Tyne and Wear in northeast England came down with it and died just 3 days later. Despite quarantines being put in place once it was realised that cholera had hit England, it didn't really help, and it just spread as fast as you'd expect through the rest of the country. But it's when it hit London that things really accelerated. And this is when what I spoke about in last week's video is relevant, because if you watch that, you'll know just how disgusting London was at this point in time. The River Thames, which flows through the heart of the city, was nothing more than a glorified sewer spilling into the streets. For centuries, people just dumped their waste into the street without thinking about the consequences. Not that the eventual introduction of plumbing made much of a difference, because the sewage system of London also led straight to the Thames. This city was a hotbed for disease, and cholera must have been rubbing its metaphorical hands in glee when it came across the Thames. In response to cholera reaching the shores, the government reconvened the Central Board of Health, which had been set up in 1805 in an attempt to combat yellow fever. Now, I'm not sure what the Board of Health were actually able to do. Their powers were very limited and they were very slow to act, which feels incredibly reminiscent of how the UK is dealing with pandemics today. They were always just like a month or two behind what they probably should have been doing. Back in 1831, the general theory of disease was miasma, the disease that bad air or poisonous vapours that were suspended in the air caused by decaying matter caused disease. This theory was only backed up when most of the people affected by cholera were the poor, the Board of Health attributing it to the poor, ill-fed and unhealthy part of the population, and especially those who've been addicted to the drinking of spirituous liquors and indulgence in irregular habits. It was more than implied that the poor brought disease on themselves by the crime of just being poor. In actuality, the poor were living in close quarters in the worst possible conditions in Victorian London, which was just disgusting in general. But for the poor, it was beyond description. And with the Industrial Revolution, the population of London was growing every day. more poor people being shoved into these tiny rooms with no access to clean water or basic hygiene. It always seems to be such a fail-safe for the governments, doesn't it? When in doubt, just blame the poor people. In 1842, a man called Edwin Chadwick, the Commissioner of the Board of Health, wrote in his report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain, "It is impossible to give a proper representation of the wretched state of many of the inhabitants of the indigent class, situated in the confined streets called Pipewell Gate and Kilgate, which are kept in a most filthy state, and to a stranger would appear inimical to the existence of human beings, where each small, ill-ventilated apartment of the house contained a family in number from 7 to 9, and seldom more than 2 beds for the whole. The want of convenient offices in the neighbourhood is attended with many very unpleasant circumstances, as it induces the lazy inmates to make use of chamber pots, which are suffered to remain in the most offensive state for several days, and are then emptied out the windows." Eventually though, as others in the city began to get cholera, not just the poor, they kind of had to backtrack on lots of these statements they made. Many scholars denied ever blaming it on the poor at all, although it is kind of undeniable. In that first year of 1831, 21,800 people died of the disease in England and Wales, and 9,600 in Scotland. It was a very quick burn of the disease, for over the next couple of years it did seem to die out. London did have a short resurgence in 1833 with just over 1,400 deaths, but then it died out again. It's the third pandemic that we're really going to focus on in this video. I say as we're probably already 15-20 minutes in. Now this third pandemic occurred from 1845 to 1859, although again the dates are debated. It broke out once again in Bengal in 1845, and from there it spread quickly outwards, once again spreading to Europe via Turkey. By the spring of 1848, cholera was found in Norway, Finland, Germany and Holland. It then spread to Belgium and Ireland before a ship from Hamburg brought the disease to the British shores that same year. This resurgence was unlike the others, it was so much stronger. And so of course when it hit London once again, it was horrendous. London was just as filthy as it had been before, except now it had an added 17 years worth of sewage and waste. Things were really building up. They were only 4 years away now from the Great Stink that would finally force politicians to make a change and completely rejuvenate London's sewage system. In total, this particular epidemic would kill over 14,000 victims. People had few ideas on how to treat such a disease, if there was even time to treat it, because most people who got it would die just hours later. In 1848, the Nuisances Removal and Disease Prevention Act, known to most as the Cholera Bill, was passed to help prevent the spread of the disease. Property owners were pushed to clean to prevent atmospheric impurity, and householders of all classes should be warned their first means of safety lies in the removal of dung heaps and solid and liquid filth of every description from beneath or about the houses and premises. They set out on a mission to connect all properties to sewers, but of course that was a huge undertaking and would take many years, by which point cholera would be rife. To give them a bit of credit, the people in charge at this point did try, like they thought they had the right idea as to how they could control the spread, only of course their answer as to what they should do with all the sewage and waste was still to throw it in the Thames. They hadn't made the connection to the water yet, still all believing in this miasma theory, and they were only going to make it worse. Everything they did to prevent it were miasmatic measures, this attempt to remove foul smells. And whilst good hygiene is always good, it didn't quite reach the source of the issue, which was dirty water. But all was not lost. There were scientists out there who were beginning to understand germ theory, this idea of contagion, although it wouldn't really take hold for another few decades. When it did eventually take hold, even the lead medical officer for London labelled germ theory as peculiar. It was so crazy, it was so out there. But one man called John Snow, nope, not that John Snow again, had other ideas. Snow was a British physician and is considered now as one of the founders of epidemiology, which is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states and events. How and why diseases occur in groups of people, to put it very simply. Snow was born in York in 1813 and at age 14 became apprenticed to be a surgeon. He first came across cholera not long after this, when he witnessed the first epidemic in Newcastle around 1831. In 1836, he moved to London to begin his formal medical education and became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons just a couple of years later. By 1844, he graduated from the University of London and was admitted to the Royal College of Physicians in 1850. But he actually made his name in medicine by being a very talented anaesthetist. He carefully studied the effects of ether and chloroform as surgical anaesthetics. He was so well known that he was actually even asked to administer chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of her 8th child, and then again for her 9th. That is what Jon Snow was most known for, but it was also known that he'd had an interest in cholera for quite a while. As we've covered, most people assumed cholera was airborne, but Jon was suspicious about this from early on. He was sure that the disease entered the body through the mouth, but wasn't exactly sure of the mechanisms behind this. With germ theory still in its early stages of development, it hadn't exactly yet received widespread acknowledgement, but Jon clearly demonstrated that he understood the premise of germ theory, even if he didn't quite have a name to put to it yet. He just kind of deduced that cholera was not due to breathing in foul air, and even proposed that the structure of cholera was that of a cell. He was a very smart man for the time. In fact, in 1849, he even made a recommendation that water be filtered and boiled before use, in one of the first ever practical applications of germ theory in public health. This is still something that's recommended today in many high-risk places: boil your water. He published his now famous essay on the mode of communication in cholera in 1849, in which he speculated that the illness was actually spread by contaminated water, and he was essentially laughed at by all of London for this. To take directly from his second version of this paper, he wrote, "Diseases which are communicated from person to person are caused by some material which passes from the sick to the healthy, and which has the property of increasing and multiplying in the systems of the person it attacks. As cholera commences with an infection of the alimentary canal, and as we have seen that the blood is not under the influence of any poison in the early stages of the disease, it follows that the morbid material producing cholera must be introduced into the alimentary canal. Must in fact be swallowed accidentally, for persons would not take it intentionally, and the increase of the morbid material or cholera poison must take place in the interior of the stomach and bowels." Again, this is a smart man. Jon Snow was determined to get to the bottom of it once and for all. So when in 1854 an outbreak occurred around Broad Street in Soho, which killed more than 550 people in just 2 weeks, he sprung into action. Here was an opportunity to prove his theory. That August, there had been a few outbreaks around London, with Soho not being touched at all until the night of the 31st of August, which of Jon wrote was the most terrible outbreak of cholera which ever occurred in the kingdom. Over the next 3 days, 127 people living around Broad Street in Soho died, and cholera didn't discriminate, hitting poor and rich alike. Within a week, 3/4 of the residents had left, the shops were closed and the houses were locked. No one wanted to be near Soho. By the 10th of September, almost 500 people had died, and Soho was a particularly filthy area of London at this time. The sewage system hadn't reached it yet, and it was hugely overpopulated, which no doubt contributed to the huge number of deaths. Jon lived relatively close by on Frith Street, which made it very easy for him to monitor this outbreak. As he'd previously noted, he was sure that cholera was a poison spread through sewage-infected water, and he had actually recently traced an outbreak in South London to a contaminated water supplied by the Vauxhall Water Company, but nobody wanted to believe him. He'd actually noted examples of water infecting people on several occasions, and of course nobody took him seriously. But he was determined that he was going to prove it, and people were going to listen. Jon Snow started to walk around the area, interviewing families of people who'd been infected by this cholera outbreak. He wrote, "Within 250 yards of the spot where Cambridge Street joins Broad Street, there were upwards of 500 fatal attacks of cholera in 10 days. As soon as I became acquainted with the situation and extent of this eruption of cholera, I suspected some contamination of the water of the much frequented street pump in Broad Street." So obviously this is before houses had running water. If you wanted water, you had to go and get it. He worked around the clock to trace each example of illness back to this particular pump. Obviously his thought being that those who lived or worked near the pump were the most likely to use it. And if that particular water supply was infected, then people would contract cholera. He inspected the pump himself and found so little impurity in it that he actually hesitated to come to a conclusion there and then, but he inquired further. He requested a list from the General Register Office of all of the most recent deaths of cholera and noted down where each infection was in relation to the pump in a dot map that you're seeing on screen right now. He deduced that the outbreak must have begun on the Thursday, when the first 4 people came down with the illness, and more followed in the coming days. He noted that there were 10 deaths that actually happened closer to another street pump, but upon interviewing the families of the deceased, he found that they always went to the pump on Broad Street, because whilst it was further away, the water was much nicer. In some other cases where children had died, the families didn't use this pump, but the children went to a school that did. Everything always linked back to Broad Street. In other cases where it couldn't more easily be traced back, John noted that all local businesses also used the water from the Broad Street pump. It was used for mixing with spirits at local pubs, a coffee shop supplied the water at dinner time. It was sold in various shops with a teaspoon of effervescing powder in it under the name of sherbet. And he noted that it was probably also used in other ways that he didn't even realise at the time. What he said is the most conclusive connection between the Broad Street pump and cholera, though, is a death that happened at Hampstead West End, which is nowhere near Soho. A death was recorded on the 2nd of September of a 59-year-old widow who had diarrhoea for 2 hours and cholera for 16 before dying. John Snow interviewed this lady's son and was informed that she hadn't been to Broad Street for many months. But he discovered that cart went from Broad Street to West End every single day, and the dead woman would always take a large bottle of water from the pump in Broad Street because she preferred it to her local water. On the 31st of August, she took the water and was dead by the Saturday. Her niece came for a visit where she also drank the water before returning to her home elsewhere in London. She also came down with cholera and died. The link was undeniable. John Snow even went as far as to investigate places around Broad Street where people probably should have died but didn't. For example, there was a workhouse nearby which was surrounded by houses in which people died from cholera. Yet somehow, out of 535 inmates, only 5 people died. Turns out the workhouse had its own pump on the premises and had little need to go elsewhere for water. If the mortality at the workhouse had been the same as outside, over 100 people should have died. And then there's a brewery on Broad Street fairly close to the pump, and John was perplexed to find that not a single worker had died of cholera. So he called the proprietor, who informed him that they employed 70 men, and none of them had suffered severely even though a couple had got ill. This is because these men were allowed a certain quantity of malt liquor each day and therefore didn't drink water, only alcohol from the brewery. That's one way to survive. By the 7th of September, John thought he had everything he needed to prove to the authorities that the cholera outbreak had stemmed from the Broad Street pump. He'd even studied the water carefully and found white flecks floating in it, which he believed were the source of contamination. Of course, we know now that you can't see cholera, but he tried. The authorities were still hesitant to believe him, even when presented with all of this evidence, but he convinced them to take the handle off the pump, and therefore make it impossible to draw water from it. It seems to me that they ended up agreeing to take the handle off just to kind of make him shut up and go away. I don't think they actually thought it would make a difference. Only of course it did, and the outbreak stopped almost immediately. People began to return to their homes in Soho. Turns out, John Snow does know something. And despite Snow's hypothesis clearly proving to be true, the Board of Health refused to do anything more to help. They refused to clean up the cesspools and sewers, saying they saw no reason to adopt his belief. A lot of this disbelief may have not only stemmed from a lack of understanding of germ theory, but also accepting this belief meant that you were accepting that fecal matter was entering the body through the mouth. And despite the poor hygiene of Victorian London, this was just too gross for people to think about. But of course, John Snow refused to stop, and he carried on tracing the outbreaks across London. He had one big question. Where had the contamination in the pump come from in the first place? There was apparently no way that sewage from the town pipes could have leaked into this pump. It should have been relatively clean water. And enter a man called Reverend Henry Whitehead, who in his mission to prove John Snow wrong, to prove that cholera wasn't caused by tainted water, but by God's divine intervention, actually proved him very right. he confirmed all of Snow's findings. Reverend Whitehead interviewed a woman who lived at 40 Broad Street, whose child had been sick with cholera in the days before the outbreak took hold. This child had caught it elsewhere. It turns out that this woman had washed her baby's nappies, or diapers for you Americans, in water, which she then dumped into a leaky cesspool just 3 foot away from the pump. This contaminated the whole water supply and kicked off the most terrible cholera outbreak London had ever seen. Reverend Whitehead eventually had to concede and admit that John Snow was entirely right. Whitehead's own findings were published in the Builder the very next year, along with a report on the awful living conditions in Soho. And no improvements whatsoever had been made in the previous 12 months, and nobody seemed bothered about fixing it. Soho and London as a whole will continue to be gross for many years. See last week's video on the Great Stink for elaboration. Eventually, once the epidemic had passed, they placed the handle back on the Broad Street pump, and still refused to believe that Snow was probably right. They ultimately attributed the 1854 epidemic to, you guessed it, miasma, despite all of the evidence otherwise. People want to see what they want to see. It wasn't until 1866, when the final cholera epidemic took place, that the Board of Health finally conceded. One man called William Farr, who'd refused to believe Snow, made his own study showing that mortality in this last epidemic was high for people drinking from a specific reservoir in East London. It was only then that people started to listen. Farr was actually one of Snow's biggest opponents back in the 50s, but now in the 60s, he's agreeing with him and backing up his points. But sadly, by that point, John Snow had already died at the young age of just 45. He passed in June 1858 after suffering a stroke and would never live to see his theories validated. He'd released a second edition of On the Mode of Communication of Cholera in 1855, detailing all of the events of the previous year, a document that you can read in full on the internet, and I'll leave links down below in case you want to go read it. I would recommend that you do, it's so interesting. As time went on, germ theory became more widely known, and by the 1890s became the standard understanding of the transmission of disease. John Snow's explanation of the transmission of cholera showed deep understanding of germ theory before he'd ever even heard the words germ theory. We have a lot to thank John Snow for, because had he not been so insistent with his findings, perhaps everyone would have been back at square one a decade later when cholera hit again. But luckily they had Snow's findings to build on in the 60s. He birthed epidemiology as we know it today. I'm quite thankful to him, because without him, would we have the podcast, This Podcast Will Kill You? I don't know, but it's my favourite podcast of all time, and I'm personally thanking John Snow for it. Years later, the Broad Street pump got removed entirely, and everyone kind of forgot about John Snow and this pump and cholera. Finally, in 1992, a replica pump was displayed on the corner of Broadwick Street, formerly Broad Street, and Poland Street, as an homage, in front of the John Snow pub. This replica got removed in 2015 due to renovation works going on in the area, but it was never quite in the right historical spot anyway. The proper historical spot was marked by a red granite plaque on the north side of John Snow pub, on the corner of Broadwick and Lexington Street. And then in the summer of 2018, the replica pump finally got placed in the correct historical position, where you can still see it today. Although I've been to this part of London numerous times, I've probably walked past it more times than I can count, I've never paid any attention. But you better believe as soon as life is normal again, I'll be going in search of Broad Street pump, and I'll have a drink at the John Snow pub in honour of him. Although apparently he was a teetotaler and part of the temperance movement, so maybe that's not the best way to honour his legacy. Maybe I'll just have a Coke instead. I've been wanting to write this video for the longest of times. I've had so much fun researching and writing this, so I hope you guys have enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed the whole process here. Thank you so much for watching. If there are any other diseases you would like me to talk about, like not the diseases but like historical events based around these diseases, then please let me know. I love doing like disease history, medical history. I find it fascinating. Epidemiology I find fascinating. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.